Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Part 1 of the $1,500 Buick Build. This is the best on a budget. i7-8700 CPU, mid-range but still very nice Z370 motherboard, GeForce GTX 1070 graphics card, NVMe SSD, 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM, RGB liquid cooler, a nice case, and a nice semi-modular power supply. This is $500 down from the $2,000 Cadillac build that I did recently with an i7-8700K and a 1080 Ti. This provides excellent 1080p and 1440p gaming with that graphics card, not really 4K, but if you're looking to save some money, it is a reasonable middle choice between the Cadillac and the Chevy. This video is the parts overview and the why vlog all rolled into one. I'm not doing them separately this time. I'm going to go through each of these parts, talk about their pros and cons and alternatives, but before we get into that, I'm going to do the 50,000 foot overview first, talk about this computer from the big picture before we get down to the nitty-gritty. First, let's talk about gaming performance. If you want to play all current games on the market at 1080p Full HD, at high to ultra detail, at 60 to 144 frames per second, depending upon the game, this machine will absolutely do that. It has all the CPU needed and all the graphics card needed to basically play anything at 1080p without any compromises or reservations. How much frame rate you get and how much detail you get is variable. You'll get lower frame rates at ultra detail. You can get higher frame rates at high detail. That's a personal choice as to whether or not you want pretty or fast. But at 1080p, basically, you have no compromises here. At 1440p standard, meaning not ultra-wide, the normal 16:9 screen, this computer will actually still play most current games at 1440p ultra detail at 60 frames per second, and many games at high detail at 100 plus frames per second. It will not play every game at 100 frames per second at ultra. You'd need a 1080 Ti for that, and even that would struggle in games. But with very minor compromises at 1440p resolution, this machine really is all that you need. Now, 1440p ultra-wide, the 21:9 screens, are a little bit different. Those are 5 million pixels. They are actually closer to 4K than they are to 1080p. This machine will absolutely do it, but it will not do them at ultra at 100 frames per second because it's 5 million pixels. It's 2.5 times a standard 1080p screen. It's a lot of pixels to move. If you're okay with 1440p at high detail ultra wide, that card absolutely will do it. It is not a problem. If you want more than that, if you want 100 frames per second, if you want very higher ultra, you'll need a 1080 Ti. But in terms of price, it's a good compromise for a screen like that. Now, what about 4K? It will do 4K, and absolutely, if you want to play Overwatch and Rainbow Six Siege and Fortnite at 4K, this is absolutely all you need. Almost overkill, but not quite actually in games like Fortnite. It'd be very nice to have. Now, would I want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands, Mass Effect Andromeda, etc. on this card at 4K? No, it doesn't have the horsepower. You need a 1080 Ti for that. But you don't need a 1080 Ti to play a lot of middle ground games at 4K. You might want more than, say, a 1060 or an RX 580 at 4K. You want the extra VRAM this has. You want the extra processing power. It is noticeable in terms of a performance jump over a 1060, but it's a lot less expensive than a 1080 Ti. Now that's gaming offline. What about live streaming? Perhaps you want to live stream to Twitch or to YouTube. This CPU will provide you with all the horsepower you need to live stream any current game on the market. I've done that with various games, including games like Ghost Recon Wildlands on my i7-8700. I do have a better graphics card, but I was also playing at 1440p. My advice is if you're going to live stream, play at 1080p. The combination of this graphics card at 1080p and that CPU, you shouldn't have any problem. The only possible caveat is system RAM. If you're going to be live streaming heavy AAA games, you might want more than 16 gigs of RAM. That's absolutely all you need to just play any game on the market. But if you also want to record and live stream your games, run OBS, run multiple monitors, you really probably should have 32 gigs of RAM. But this is enough for not live streaming anything. Or if you're going to live stream Overwatch, CSGO, League of Legends, etc., 16 gigs would be absolutely plenty. What about non-gaming performance? A lot of these videos on YouTube end up being all about the gaming. How well does it game? How well does it play games, stream games, etc.? Not everybody cares about gaming. Perhaps you want to put together a high-end system for multitasking, content creation, 3D animation. Maybe you just want something snappy and responsive. To be honest, this build is overkill for the average person if you're not focused on gaming. There's no need to spend that much money on a graphics card. Frankly, as nice as the CPU is, even it's overkill. An i5-8400 or a Ryzen 5 1600 would be plenty for the average person looking to just multitask, watch videos, do your taxes, edit work documents. This is really overkill for that. Now, if by chance you're doing something complicated, scientific computing, etc., maybe you want to build a server or a workstation or a high-end content creation machine, well, this probably isn't right for that either, because if you're doing that, then you might actually want more cores. You might want to be on a professional platform like X299 or X399. You might want to consider Ryzen 7. So this machine is really heavily entertainment and gaming focused. About a third of this machine's budget is in the graphics card. Between the graphics card and the CPU, that's actually half the budget right there. So if you're not interested in gaming, you can spend a whole lot less than this and still get an amazing fast computer that does everything else just fine. Side note, a lot of people are under the impression that if you're running Photoshop or Illustrator or doing video editing, you need a 1070 or 1080 or a really fancy graphics card. You don't. There are a very small number of people doing that kind of work who need GPU accelerated encoding, but most encoding is still done on the CPU. Adobe Premiere Pro, when I do these videos for YouTube, for example, that's all CPU. Some of the effects and transitions are GPU accelerated, but it's such a minor percentage. I have tested this, by the way. I put in a previous generation GTX 960, very basic card, compared to a modern 1070 in one of my 4K videos. The render time difference was like 1%. It was trivial. So you don't need a high-end graphics card for that, unless you're truly a professional content creator, in which case you really should be on the high-end platforms. I am filming this video in February of 2018. One of the things I haven't addressed so far, but I will talk about it here, is the fact that the $1,500 price for this machine is at normal retail prices. Everything that you see here is currently at normal retail prices, except for the graphics card. The current GPU market is a bit out of whack. The $1,500 price has that budgeted at $450, which is what it should cost. However, unfortunately, today in February 2018, those are currently going for more, sometimes much more. One consideration is to buy a pre-built machine. And by pre-built, I don't mean Dell, Acer, HP, Lenovo, etc. I mean CyberPower, iBuyPower, Origin PC, etc. Now, I have done a number of reviews of those machines on my channel in the past. I will put a link or two down in the video description below to a couple of recommended machines that are similar to this at a similar price point. The benefit, you can actually buy one of those today with a nice graphics card. The downside is you don't get to pick out your individual components. You don't get to pick out which liquid cooler you want, which SSD you want, which motherboard you want. You sort of have to take whatever they put in there. So there's pros and cons to both routes. Or you can just pay maybe $300, give or take more, say $1,800 instead of $1,500, and build exactly what you see. Hopefully in the coming days, weeks, and months, graphics cards return to normal prices, and then we can just go back to building machines again. So that's the 50,000-foot overview for this build. What about the comparison to the $2,000 Cadillac build versus the $1,000 Chevy build? This fits right in the middle. It's the Buick. Well, this definitely has more performance than what you'll get for $1,000. At $1,000, you're looking at a GTX 1060 3GB card or an RX 580 4GB card at normal prices, mind you, or one of the pre-builts I've talked about in the past. Those are great 1080p gaming machines, but not really ideal for 1440p, outside of CSGO, League of Legends, and Overwatch, of course. But for AAA games, they're pretty much strictly 1080p machines. They also generally have less CPU speed, they're not liquid cooled, they don't come with overclockable motherboards as often, although you can custom build one that way. And for $1,000, you're sort of looking at just a little bit less of everything. Now, the $2,000 build is sort of the best of the best without the price reservations, at normal prices. It gets you a K chip and 5 GHz overclocking. It gets you a 1080 Ti instead of a 1070. It gets you true 4K gaming even in AAA titles. It gets you 4K excellent high refresh rate gaming in esports titles. Overwatch will easily run at 100 plus frames per second at 4K even at ultra detail. But not everybody wants to spend $2,000, so this is sort of the middle ground. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. I would like to put a reminder in here. Custom PCs are custom. This is just a suggested build guide. Case choices, power supply choices, cooler choices, brand of motherboard and graphics card choices, brand of SSD choices. These are all extremely personal decisions. If you're custom building a machine and you say, well, I would rather have a Cooler Master case, or I'd rather have a Corsair liquid cooler, or I'd rather have MSI, Asus, or ASRock, that's fine. It's your PC, build it your way. Generally, when you're spending $150 to $200 on a motherboard, it doesn't really matter which company you buy from. They're pretty similar in terms of features. At a given price point on graphics cards, they are about the same, give or take. You have your entry-level cards and you have your premium overclocked cards from the factory. Same thing with liquid coolers. Most 120 coolers cool about the same. Most 240s cool about the same. Case choices are all over the map. There are 1,000,001 case choices. So, if your comment is, why did you pick those parts? They were on the shelf and they fit the $1,500 budget as much as anything else, to be honest. It is a nice build, but you can always change it. But every change adds cost. Want a bigger case? Want a Corsair Obsidian 450D, for example? It's a little bit wider, a little bit taller. It'll take larger coolers, but it costs $50 more. Want a 1080? Sure, for $50 or $100 more, you can have one. Want the K chip instead of the non-K chip? Again, another $50 or so, or you can have one. 50, 50, 50, 50. Pretty soon you've gotten the $2,000 machine. So that's how that happens. You $50 yourself to a whole other price category. If you're going to start raising one component, you might want to ask yourself what else needs to be raised to match it. What I don't like doing is building mismatched systems. For example, putting a locked i5-8400 with a 1080 Ti, in my opinion, would be a bit silly. Likewise, putting a 3GB GTX 1060 with an i7-8700K overclocked to 5 GHz is equally silly. So this is sort of a balanced mix of components that I think work well together in a $1,500 build. I am now going to go through each of the parts in detail and talk about alternatives and pros and cons and what you get for the money going up or down a notch on each of them. But before I do that, a friendly reminder. Everything I'm about to show you and talk about is linked down in the video description below to Amazon and Newegg. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. If you found this useful, helpful, and informative, or perhaps just entertaining, please use those when shopping. It really does help. The first place to start is the CPU, the i7-8700. This is the non-K chip. It currently retails for about $300, 6 cores, 12 threads. It does have a fairly low base clock speed, but that does not matter because it has an all-core out-of-the-box turbo speed of 4.3 gigahertz. Not overclocked, it's actually the same speed as an i7-8700K on all 6 cores. They both run at 4.3 in their max turbo all-core mode. So buying a K chip, if you're not going to manually overclock it, does absolutely nothing for you over this CPU. Now, the K chip does have the benefit of an unlocked multiplier and will go higher, but so will this. This has a max turbo speed of 4.6. Now, if you turn on enhanced turbo in most decent motherboards, you can actually get these CPUs to run at 4.6 gigahertz, and we're going to test that in the next video. But 4.3, 4.6, they're both pretty close to each other. Unless you're going for a top-of-the-line, best-of-the-best build, the real-world performance difference, even between 4.3 and 4.6, is not that large. You might be looking at anywhere between maybe 3, 5, or 7 frames per second difference if you are CPU bound and going for high refresh rate gaming. If you're going to play games at 1080p at medium detail to get 144 frames per second, for example, you're a competitive online gamer, maybe you want 200 frames per second. Fair enough, that might be why you want to go to 5 gigahertz. But for 100 to 144 frames per second at high detail, this actually will be just fine. It does have the benefit of saving you about $50 over the K chip. It does come with a cooler, by the way, but I wouldn't use it. The stock cooler from Intel is fine on the i3s and i5s. It's not on the i7. I have tested that. I've put this chip on the stock cooler that came in the box. It thermal throttles when you put it under full load. It's fine most of the time. The stock cooler is not enough for an i7, even a locked i7. That's why we have a liquid cooler, even on a non-K chip. One of the first questions that may be asked is, why not go with an i5-8600K? It's $50 less than this, and it's unlocked. You can run it at 5 gigahertz. Well, yeah, you can. I would take 6 cores and 12 threads at 4.6 gigahertz all day long over 6 cores and 6 threads on the i5 at 5 gigahertz. The $50 increase, while granted it takes the K off and means you can't go to 5 gigahertz, it does mean that you have 12 threads. If you're building a $1,500 machine today in 2018 and it's only got 6 threads, I think you're going to be really, really sorry in 18 months that you did that. 4-core, 8-thread chips are now the entry-level processor. They're down to $150 on the AMD side with Ryzen. I understand that 4 cores, 8 threads used to be top of the line. But if you buy an i5 chip, you are decidedly in the middle of the space today and may very well be entry-level just 12 to 18 months from now, because we may very well see 4-core, 8-thread chips at $120 to $125 sometime in 2018. Those have more threads than the current i5s do. Even though you buy an i5-8600K, you still have 6 threads. No matter how fast they run, you are going to find games in the next 18 months, in my opinion, where that starts to become a limitation. In the benchmarking that I've done in the past few months on the current i5s, I'm already finding games use all 6 threads. If you're building a $1,500 machine today, do you already want the CPU to be fully utilized and fully maxed out? Or do you want to have some growing room? What the i7 gives you is some room to grow. If you're truly going to choose the compromise choice, if you're going to say, I'll go with the i5 because I'm willing to go more middle of the ground, I want to save a little bit of money, let me offer you a suggestion. Ryzen 5 1600 or Ryzen 5 1600X. 6 cores, 12 threads, slightly lower clock speed, less ideal for over 100 frames per second gaming, but still totally adequate. And while it won't run as at high of a clock speed, it costs less and installs on a lower cost motherboard. Speaking of the motherboard, there are almost as many choices of motherboards as there are cases. You can pick from anything from $100 on up to $250, frankly up to $500, although those are a bit crazy. This is a nice middle-of-the-road option that is very fully featured and that will handle both this CPU and an upgrade in the future, assuming the 9th gen chips work on the Z370 series. Wi-Fi and hardwired gigabit LAN are included, tons of RGB, triple M.2, I've reviewed that separately, link to that down in the description below, but you could go with the Ultra Gaming if you want to save a few dollars. It's generally about $30 less expensive, less RGB, it doesn't have the Wi-Fi, it has 8-phase power delivery instead of 10, but that's not going to matter on this CPU. So why is this going in here? Because it just makes it nice and it has some extra features. If you want the Wi-Fi, if you want the triple M.2 slots, for example, the Ultra Gaming only has 2. If you want some of the extra features that are on here, the Sound Blaster audio software, the $30 cost of this over the cost of the Ultra Gaming is not too bad. You could go a completely different direction, however, and go all the way down to Gigabyte's basic board, which can be found for as little as $100. This CPU would actually be just fine there, and that would save you $100 in this build. But it gets rid of the RGB, it gets rid of the high-end sound chip, it gets rid of a number of features that are on this board. So whether or not you want to go with a deluxe board in a $1,500 build, or save yourself $100, maybe get a non-fancy, non-RGB board with lower-end sound, less M.2 slots, no Wi-Fi, a lower-end LAN chip, and maybe put that money into a GTX 1080, I certainly understand. As I said, custom machines are custom. Now, as far as Gigabyte as a brand goes, the MSI Gaming Carbon Pro AC, the Asus ROG Strix-E board, the ASRock Tai Chi board are all roughly similar to this in terms of capability and features. Slight variations and differences, but they're all in the same ballpark. All of those boards have been on my test bench back there. All of them will run any of the Intel CPUs without a problem. Likewise, with each of the brands, there are less expensive versions. You could go, for example, with one of the Prime boards from Asus and save yourself $50 or so. And likewise, you can go with an Extreme 4 gaming motherboard from ASRock, save yourself about $50 there. And MSI has the Crate Gaming, for example. I actually did a build with that. So there's lots of ways to save money with this. When it comes to your motherboard, just realize that when you pay more, you get more. But you're getting features. Performance-wise, there is zero difference between this chip at 4.6 gigahertz on a $100 board, a $200 board, or a $500 board. It is extreme overclocking on the top-end boards, which doesn't matter here. And then it's RGB, M.2 slots, what kind of LAN or Wi-Fi chip does it have, how much RGB does it have, how many SATA ports does it have, what kind of audio chip, that sort of thing. That's what you're looking at when you buy a motherboard. CPU cooler choices. There are an endless variety of choices for CPU coolers. I personally use a lot of Cooler Master and Corsair coolers, but I've recently started using Noctua and Be Quiet products as well. When it comes to silence, Those are very, very nice, but they do tend to cost a little bit more. In a $1,500 price, if you want some bling and perhaps some really nice liquid cooling, this is an interesting choice. $50 buys you an RGB 120mm liquid cooler. That's less expensive than most companies' non-RGB liquid coolers. It's very, very nice. I've used Cooler Master several times in the past. Their liquid coolers, I've not had a problem. In fact, my i7-8700K on my test bench behind me has the 280mm Cooler Master back there, and it runs at 5 gigahertz just fine. For the 4.3 to 4.6 gigahertz this will run at, this is all you need. You don't need to spend extra on a 240 or 280 for this CPU. That being said, you don't really need a liquid cooler. A Hyper 212 Evo, a Hyper 612, a Noctua U9S, for example, the small 95mm cube cooler would also do a very nice job. The Shadow Rock from Be Quiet, etc. You could also use a Corsair H50, H55, or H60. Those are all choices as well. I wouldn't use the stock cooler. I mentioned this before. It's not enough for the i7 at these clock speeds. The i5-8400 comes with the same stock cooler, and it runs turbo at 3.8 gigahertz on 6 cores, 6 threads. It's fine. I've stress tested it with Ada64, no issue. This thermal throttles with the stock cooler at 4.3 gigahertz, Ada64, much less 4.6. So don't use the stock cooler. Get something else, anything else in the maybe $20 to $50 price range. System RAM choices. 16 gigs is the minimum you should be putting into a $1,500 build. 8 gigs is simply not an option. 32 gigs is unnecessary for most people unless you plan to actually live stream Ghost Recon Wildlands, Mass Effect Andromeda, those kinds of games that already use more than 8 gigs just for themselves. And if you're streaming and recording and running overlays and OBS and have multiple programs running, yeah, you really want to have 32 gigs. 16 is really pushing it, but that's for top-of-the-line live streaming. And frankly, if you're going to spend the money that 32 gigs cost, get the K-chip, get a bigger cooler, and go to the $2,000 Cadillac build. So 16 gigs is kind of it. Now, as far as RAM speed goes, this is DDR4 2400. I am aware that faster RAM exists and you can use faster RAM in this system. This costs less. On 16 gigs, you can currently save between $20 to $40 by buying 2400 versus 3000 or 3200. And again, this is a system about making compromises. The real-world performance difference in most games and most applications between 2400 and 3200 is maybe 1 to 3% at most. What does this mean? Your game runs at 85 frames per second instead of 87. Big deal. That's never going to be a noticeable difference. If I put two identical machines side by side, one with 2400, one with 3200, lets you play the same game in the same area at the same time without a frame rate counter running, you could not tell the difference. They are that close. It is an extremely minor difference. It's the sort of thing that people look at benchmark charts and go, oh, well, I better spend the money. Look, that bar graph is larger than the other one. Yeah, but look at the numbers. Look at the real world. It doesn't really make any difference. I've tested RAM all the way up to DDR4 4000. It is an incredibly minor difference in most situations. The few situations where it matters, you're not building this machine anyway. You're building something fancier and more expensive. So save your money and get 2400, assuming it saves you $20 to $40. Now, if when you watch this video, there's only a $10 price difference between 2400 and 3200, by all means, okay, fine, spend the $10. That's easy. But if it's a $40 price difference, I would put that $40 into a K-chip or into a 1080 instead of a 1070 Ti before I'd buy faster RAM. There's so many other things to spend the money on. Larger SSD, a nicer cooler, a bigger case. Spend it somewhere else before you put it into faster RAM. Storage solutions. We have 2 SSDs and a hard drive that's not on the desk at the moment, but that's beside the point. We have a 256 gigabyte Intel 600p NVMe SSD. Those drives currently run over $100. However, you can find a lot of good drives in that size at about the $100 price point. Western Digital's Black, ADATA's SX7000 or 6000 drives. Actually, the 6000 is about $90. You can get a number of drives like that. Or you can spend $20 or $30 more and buy a Samsung 960 EVO, which is faster than all of them, but for the average user doesn't really matter. We also have a 250 gigabyte Western Digital SATA SSD. These are currently $79, and it saves you a couple dollars over the NVMe drive. Some people may ask the question, why not just get two NVMEs, or why not just get one SSD that's larger? You could. These were on my shelf. If I were actually building this machine, yes, I would probably just get a 500 gig NVMe SSD and skip the SATA, but I don't have an extra one of those, but I have these, so it's going in there. For a $1,500 build, a single 250 or 256 gig SSD isn't large enough in my opinion. You're going to want to put your games on the SSD. They will load faster, levels will load faster, scene transitions will be faster. It's just a much nicer experience. 500 gigs of SSD gives you enough room to put your games on. Please note, the real performance difference of your games on an NVMe versus SATA drive, pretty minor overall. I run most of mine on the SATA drive. I do have NVMEs in most of my nice systems. So put Windows, put your Office application, put maybe one or two games, put your most frequently used stuff on the NVMe, and then put the big games that take up 50 or 60 gigabytes each on the SATA drive. Also included in the $1,500 budget, but not pictured here, is a 2 terabyte Seagate 7200 RPM hard drive. Now, the 2 terabyte drives are currently only $10 more expensive than the 1 terabyte drive, so skip the 1 terabyte, they're no longer worth buying, the price is too close. You might consider buying a 4 terabyte drive. Those are less than double the price of a 2 terabyte drive. If you need some extra space, by all means. Now, you can put games on hard drives and you can run games from hard drives. Most games, in terms of frame rate, will perform the same on a hard drive or SSD. The benefit of putting it on the SSD is faster load time, faster launch time, much faster updating times because games constantly have patches and updates. But SSDs cost money, and I understand that if you have a large game collection, it's prohibitively expensive to put it all on SSDs. Whether or not you want to put a 2 terabyte hard drive and a 250 gig SATA drive in here, or skip the hard drive and put a 500 gig SATA drive, is entirely your choice. As I said at the beginning of the video, custom PCs are custom. Arrange the storage however you want. But in this $1,500 budget, there is room for the NVMe drive, the SATA drive, and the hard drive. Video card choices. I already talked about video cards earlier in the video when it comes to resolution, gaming, etc. Let me just talk about budgets. This retails for $450. In February of 2018, when I'm making this video, you cannot buy one for $450, but I'm putting it there at the normal retail price because it's my hope that in the not too distant future, graphics card prices will return to normal and you can buy one for $450 again. Or you might just get lucky, or where you live, perhaps you find one on a store shelf somewhere. For between $50 to $100 more, you can get a GTX 1080. Whether it's worth it is a personal choice. At 1440p ultra-wide, a 1080 is probably worth it. The faster VRAM, the GDDR5X on a 1080 versus the non-X GDDR5 on this, will definitely help. At standard 1440p and 1080p, I think it's less of a concern. The actual performance of the two cards, a 1070 Ti versus a 1080 stock out of the box, is very, very close until you go up in resolution. The further up in resolution you go, the higher the details go, the larger the difference between the cards. Now, a 1080 Ti, even at normal retail prices, will not realistically fit into this budget. $700 to $750 is what a 1080 Ti normally sells for, although they don't today. They're over $1,000 at the moment in February of 2018. But if you're going to spend half your budget on your graphics card, you're going to have to strip out a lot of other things to fit it in. You could. A Ryzen 5 1600X with this liquid cooler, minus one of the SSDs, maybe with a lower end motherboard or whatnot, you could probably fit or squeeze a 1080 Ti in, but you're going to put a lot of compromises into your machine to get there. And a 1080 Ti on a Ryzen 5 1600 or 1600X strikes me as a bit of a mismatch between the two. If you've got $750 for a graphics card, you've got $350 for a CPU, and it's better paired with it. Let me offer a caveat to this. Because of the shortage of graphics cards, if you're watching this and cannot find those for a reasonable price, look for a 3GB GTX 1060. They come in and out of stock occasionally in the $250 price range. Now that's $50 over retail, but it's the best we can do in February of 2018. The 20 series of cards are rumored to come out in the summer of 2018. Now there'll be a shortage on those as well, but maybe you can snag one when they first launch. You could consider building this build as it is, but swap this out for a $250 GTX 1060 3GB card. That'll take $200 off the price, lowering it to $1,300. with the plan to replace the graphics card with the next gen when they come out in about 6 months' time. Again, shortage of graphics cards, we kind of have to be creative when it comes to these sorts of machines. That leads us to our system case. Now, the Spec02 you can see back there, I've previously done a review of that. Cases are such a personal choice, it's difficult to even have a cohesive conversation. You have little ITX cases, you have micro ATX, mid-tower ATX cases, full tower cases. There are so many different brands and so many different options to choose from. Do you want tempered glass? Do you want plastic? Do you want a solid case with no window at all? Do you want RGB fans, red LED or blue LED fans, or no color on it? There's just so many choices. Any case I pick is going to have people going, I love it and I hate it. What I will suggest to you is that buying a super expensive case for anything less than a super expensive build, unless you just like the pretties and the shinies, doesn't make a lot of sense. Likewise, going with a really small basic case from a no-name manufacturer doesn't make any sense unless you're building a $500 super budget machine. That is a compromise choice. I personally love the step up from it, which is the Corsair Obsidian 450D, but it's $50 more expensive. And some people would rather put that $50 somewhere else. If we're holding our budget, do you want to give up the hard drive, for example, just to get a nicer case? I would personally actually, yes, but I try to build machines that are compromises that will work for the widest possible viewers rather than what I personally would build. For those of you curious, I wouldn't even use a 450D. Most of my machines are built in Obsidian 750Ds, which are full tower cases. I live in Texas, everything is bigger here, so most of my custom built machines are actually put in very, very large cases. I've had a number of people ask about doing a mini ITX build. I've never actually done a mini ITX build, but I will do one sometime in 2018. It's on my list. I know people want to see one. All I can suggest when it comes to cases is buy something nice that's easy to work in, buy something that fits all of your components, maybe leaves you a little room to add some extra storage in the future, and certainly be sure to check to make sure your motherboard and cooler will fit in whichever case that you choose. For power supplies, I'm of two minds. Now, I'm putting in the Corsair CX550M semi-modular power supply. It's all the power this system needs. This system would run fine with a 1080 Ti or a Vega 56 with that power supply. You really don't need a 750 watt power supply for this sort of build. Now, that is an 80 plus bronze. I'm of two minds here. I could easily make an argument for going to an 80 plus gold. For $20 to $30 more than that, you can go to the TX series from Corsair, which is the 80 plus gold series, or for about double the price, for about $100, you can go to the RMX line. Now, the RMX line is actually technically a superior power supply. It's better internally, it's better with power delivery. For overclocking, if you're going for example, the K chip and you're going to put a 280 millimeter liquid cooler, yes, absolutely go for the 80 plus gold RMX line. Skip the TX, by the way, if you're going to go to 5 gigahertz. But the TX 80 plus gold would be absolutely fine for this because we're not trying to do extreme overclocking. We're just running a reasonable system at a mild turbo boost with a factory overclocked card that we're not going crazy with. And so there's no need to spend over $100 on a power supply. It just comes down to, do you want the 85% power efficiency of the bronze or the almost 90% power efficiency of the 80 plus gold TX series? That's a personal choice. Now, as far as brand goes, whether you go with Corsair, Seasonic, Cooler Master, Thermaltake, or others, at the $50-ish price range, there's not a lot of difference between the different brands. They all tend to offer pretty similar features. Some are modular, some are semi-modular, and some are fully modular, but beyond that distinction, most of them are pretty similar. To be completely honest, this has a Corsair power supply for the simple reason that it's a Corsair case, and I have several on the shelf, so at that price range, I pulled it off. It could have easily been a Master Watt 550 from Cooler Master, for example, and it would have accomplished exactly the same thing. I want to end this video with some general thoughts about purchasing computer hardware in general. Spend more, get more. Now, that might sound self-explaining or obvious. Why would you even say that? Well, I get asked all the time, is it worth it to spend X to get X? Should I buy an i7 over an i5? Should I buy a Ryzen 7 over a Ryzen 5? Should I get this card over that card? If you have the money, yes. Even if you don't fully utilize it today, you'll grow into it. Most of you actually don't need 12 threads right now. The i5 with the 6 threads is fine in 2018. In 2020, you'll really wish you had the 12 threads because the 6 threads, I think, will be very, very limiting 2 years from now. However, you can't just spend the $100 2 years from now and glue the extra threads on. You can only buy them today. Your logic might be, well, I'll just upgrade. Sure, but in 2 years, you'll need a new motherboard, possibly new RAM. DDR5 RAM is coming. You'll need to change everything. You'll rip your whole machine apart. If you just spend the extra $50 to $100 now, you could possibly skip that upgrade and buy a whole nother year of use out of your computer for a $50 to $100 increase in cost now. If you're going to put your money into anything in your computer, put it in your CPU. It's the hardest thing to upgrade because it requires a platform change most of the time. Yes, I know Ryzen's supposed to be supported for 4 years. We'll see how well that works out. Even just 1 year post-launch on the 300 series boards, there have been some compatibility issues with the new Raven Ridge APUs. Hopefully they'll get worked out with BIOS fixes. But keep in mind that promising future support on CPUs that don't yet exist on a motherboard that's already been delivered to the customer, that depends upon future BIOS updates, which may or may not be possible, and of course the development budget of each motherboard company. It sounds nice, but in my experience, a CPU change really means you're going to change your motherboard at the same time. Very, very rarely do you get to change your CPU without a motherboard swap. Likewise with your graphics card. If you just want to play games at 1080p, 60 frames per second, high detail preset, you don't need a 1070 Ti. A GTX 1060 3GB card will do that just fine. Today in February of 2018. What about in the summer of 2019? Yeah, probably not. There are going to be games then. Now you might say, well, that's only 18 months from now. Yes, but it's 3 years from when the card came out. Remember, the 10 series of cards came out in the summer of 2016. The design is 18 months old already. So if you buy the $200 to $250 card, you're buying it halfway through its life at this point. So if you've got the money, if you can find one of these for $450 and it's $200 or $250 more than a 3GB 1060, if you get 3 years of use out of it, you are not wasting your money. You're not future-proofing yourself so much as you're future-resisting. You're putting off when you have to buy an upgrade. Same thing with a 1080 Ti. Yeah, it's a lot more money, but if it gets you another 18 months beyond that card, again, you're getting value for the money and possibly better future resale value. If you look at the older products, the top of the line in each category holds its value the best. Going back 3 years or 4 years to a GTX 780 Ti, that card had 3 gigs of RAM and still plays games today at 1080p high detail just fine. The GTX 770? Not so much. There's a big difference today between a 770 and a 780 Ti. And the same thing is true of the CPUs. If you'd bought an i5 a couple of years ago, you'd have gotten a 4-core, 4-thread chip, which is very limiting today. Battlefield 1 multiplayer online on a 4-core, 4-thread chip is not a great experience. I know some of you will say, I do it. Yeah, you haven't tried it on one of these yet. Do it and you'll be like, holy smokes, that's so much better. Here's the funny thing. It's not faster. It's smoother. Your average frame rate will not go up substantially going from a 4-core i5 to a 6-core 12-thread i7. But the frame pacing will be so much better and so much smoother. It's a much nicer experience. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, and as always, video description is where it's at. All the affiliate links for all this stuff to Amazon and Newegg are down there. Please consider supporting me by using those when shopping. I would greatly appreciate it. Upcoming parts to this video, the build, testing, and so on will be coming up very soon. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.